Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site, covering, of course, the Arizona Cardinals. And with me is co-host Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, Arizona Cardinals site from SB Nation, and also a host from the original Draft Breakdown podcast. And it is officially the time to start subscribing. If you don't normally subscribe to that show, not only grab those free shows, become a patron on Patreon, where you can get, for $2 a month, you can get their bonus episodes, and for $4 a month, you get the bonus episodes and any of the articles that he and Justin put together leading up to the draft. This is the time of year to get to know everything, and then you can go back to previous episodes during the season as they talked about different conferences, games, matchups, and all that. And Seth was just telling me that you just posted your two of your most popular shows in terms of listenership than you've ever had, right?
Yeah, and it's just getting to that point of the time where, people want as much information as they can get, and we discussed, the names that were finally entering the draft, guys like, CJ Stroud, Jordan Addison, Quentin Johnston. And then, we've been discussing, because the Cardinals are one of the teams that are dealing with their new regime and how that's going to play out the draft. So there's actually a pretty good conversation in episode 176 where we discuss what Monti Ossenfort's kind of decision-making from his past jobs could lead to what he's thinking about doing here, because you look at what they've done in Tennessee and then New England, and they've never really had the opportunity to draft a Will Anderson type edge rusher, but they have drafted a ton of Jalen Carters to try to make that. So, would that be something that they would do right out the gate? So it's just an interesting conversation to have, and something that, makes it a little more fun for Cardinals fans to listen to as well.
Absolutely. And in this edition of the show, we are still talking about the Cardinals and their front office and coaching situation, because guess what? The Cardinals still do not have a head coach, but they have 8 candidates. There's been lots going on. Things have been heating up on a couple of candidates, so we're going to discuss that, and also kind of a surprise discussion about a hiring in the front office of a position that, to my knowledge, that the Cardinals have never had. So let's go ahead and get started. On tap in this episode, what we're talking about is Sean Payton, Dan Quinn, DeMeco Ryans, and then also the hiring of assistant general manager Dave Sears. So let's start with, and then as well, at the very end, a revelation that we learned about the Cardinals general manager hiring that was actually kind of a bummer to hear about. But let's start with talking about Sean Payton. It felt like he was the number one popular target for Cardinals fans. Then with the hiring of Monti Ossenfort as general manager, it felt like things cooled. And especially because while they had requested permission from the New Orleans Saints to interview him, since he's still technically under contract with the Saints despite retiring a year ago, it felt like things had kind of cooled and maybe there wasn't the interest there. However, report comes out today, on Tuesday, that Payton, or I guess it was early this week, that Payton will in fact interview with the Arizona Cardinals on Thursday, and that after he had interviewed with the Broncos, there was supposedly a second interview scheduled that might or might not have been scheduled, but has since been pushed. And then on top of that, ESPN's Diana Rossini tells us in a report that there is a quote-unquote another team, surprise team, waiting in the wings to swoop up on Sean Payton. I don't know what to think about this, but it certainly makes for some interesting things. So, are you surprised that it's taken this long for Payton to be finally interviewed by the Cardinals?
Yes and no. I mean, when you look at it, it's always tough when you're going with the general manager hire first. And by the way, it makes sense to hire the GM first, right? Like doing these in kind of order or whatever. But so it would make sense. And then, when they hired Ossenfort, like you said, it kind of felt like,
because it felt like the entire time that if Sean Payton were going to be hired, that he would, I don't know if he would have carried the title of general manager like Buddy Ryan did back in 1993-94, but he would come in with an expectation of power over the roster. Yeah,
and Ben Albright, who is a media member in
the Denver
and been keeping tabs on this whole situation. Want to make sure I get it. He's with KOA Colorado. He's been very open about what he believes is going on, and one of the situations, it's not just the compensation for Payton, and this is Denver related, but I'm gonna guess this is kind of all NFL teams that all 4 of the 5 that had interviewed Payton. It's not just compensation. There are concerns about the amount of control he wants top to bottom. There are some about the people he wants for his staff. And so when you look at it from that perspective, and for like Denver, we know that allegedly he's going to want to bring Vic Fangio.
And that would be weird because they fired him a year ago.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah, so I just don't know how that would work. And is that what he's alluding to in that situation, right? Like, and I'm not saying that's what he is alluding to, but it would make sense from the Denver perspective. And we're not trying to break any news. We're not saying anything. We're speculating on this. Could it be that the Cardinals are interested in retaining Vance Joseph on their staff? Right or wrong, we're not saying. But maybe that again is they don't want to bring in Fangio. I'm not. I don't know. I'm just speculating. Maybe that could be a Cardinals issue. Obviously, the compensation, like we mentioned, and then let's be honest, the money is an issue,
right?
Man.
I mean, well, there's a lot of things to consider because a team that hires Sean Payton or wants to hire Sean Payton is going to have to give him a level of control that a general manager might not want to have to deal with, especially when they're being charged with building a roster. You're going to have to pay him a crap ton of money, and on top of that, you have to compensate the Saints. And from what Payton is saying, he said in an interview sometime last week that he knows that what the Saints are expecting are a first-round pick in the middle to late part of the first round. Is kind of now. The Saints haven't come out and said anything, but there's been reports about multiple first-round picks. But I believe kind of more of what Payton is saying, because I would assume that he's been kind of in contact with Mickey Loomis of the Saints and everything going on there, that they're kind of expecting a first-round mid-ish pick, which the Cardinals are not in a position to do. The Broncos aren't in a position to be able to do. And so it's really interesting to consider that. Now, here's the part that I want to ask. It came out that Denver was going to do a second interview with him. Then it came out that was delayed and that he's coming to Arizona, which leads this question. Is the Arizona interview simply leverage? And is this reported surprise other team out there also a leverage play by Payton's camp? Because to me, it feels that way. Because the fact that he hadn't interviewed with Arizona, and he's the one that kind of could have at some point last week, but did not. Maybe he was getting ready for his, his studio work for Fox. But doesn't it kind of feel like that he's trying to create leverage where there might not be, because it's now coming out that the interest in Payton might have cooled because of all the factors involved, and that he's trying to create some leverage. So let's leverage Arizona against Denver. Let's say that there's a surprise team out there that might come out if things don't come out. And I don't know at this point, does Payton, other than just hearing what he has to say, just leaving no stone unturned, does Sean Payton even make sense for the Cardinals anymore with the decisions they already made with their front office?
I think there's a couple of things. I think one, again, it's the easiest thing to get an idea on. And so, I've talked about that already, but like, you just look at it, and the reality is they spelling out Payton and Fangio is the easiest thing to visualize, right?
Yeah, totally.
And so there's just nothing to it at that point. So I think in that sense, it's why I think a lot of fans are okay with it, especially, obviously Payton's background and work with Drew Brees makes him an ideal fit. Hopefully for Kyler, I think for a lot of fans, it gives Kyler the best opportunity to be successful. And again, that's what, even if you want to move on, the reality is that that's 2 years away. And so why not find the guy who could potentially get the most out of him? So, all of that makes sense. But for me, the big thing is you have a guy that is explicitly, and maybe saying is the wrong thing, but explicitly making it known that he wants a lot of say in everything. And I'm not opposed to that. You and I have had this discussion about the lack of say and control that Cliff Kingsbury had, and that it was, detrimental in the end. But the reality is you can't just expect to hire a new GM and
give him no power.
Right. And so to me, the hiring of Ossenfort doesn't give the road to coming up with Sean Payton. In fact, it just feels like there's other people that make sense more than him, if you are looking at it just from how this all pulls together.
Right. And especially when you have Ossenfort talking about, a Cardinal way, complete unification from top to bottom as to goals. Sean Payton, as good as a coach as he's been, does it feel like that he would come in and immediately align with Bidwell, Ossenfort and company? That would be a hard sell, right?
And I've told you this off the air. My biggest concern with Payton is that this is, and it's probably a lot of it's just being a jaded Cardinals fan, but this is 100% a move that you see the Cardinals make.
This has the potential of a Denny Green move, right? This is like Denny Green with a better pedigree, but he came in with a 60, winning more than 60% of his game. He hadn't won a Super Bowl, but he had some really great success with those Viking teams. And the Cardinals themselves experienced zero success with him. That did build the base for what Wissenhunt did, but nonetheless, it was disappointment.
Right, and it also just feels like it could be one of those situations where you get a guy that may not be completely invested. And I'm not saying that he wouldn't do a great job or work his butt off or any of that stuff, but like, it always makes me nervous when a guy is demanding $25 million and control of everything, because then there's really no checks and balances, right? And this guy is kind of in charge of everything. He kind of rules the roost, and then he's also the second highest paid coach in the NFL. And I have no problem with the compensation of that. Like if Sean Payton has turned around an abysmal moribund franchise and won them a Super Bowl. I've seen people come to the like, oh, well, he only won one Super Bowl. Okay, well, that's one more than the Arizona
Right.
Cardinals have in their entire history.
And it's 9 playoff seasons, 9 playoff appearances in 15 seasons. For a team that was, their fans wore bags over their heads at their games regularly. They weren't the Saints, they were the Aints. This was a team that was mired in as much sadness as Cardinals fans, only Cardinals fans care less when the Cardinals are bad overall. And so,
right.
like, he only won one Super Bowl, but look what he did. He took a team that was historically bad, took it to its 15 years of success, 9 playoff appearances. I think it was 9 double-digit victories seasons. And the Cardinals, since they moved to Arizona, have had 1, 2, 3, 4 seasons with double-digit wins.
Right.
4.
And they fired a coach that got them one. And so that's the thing, is like, it's tough in and of itself to see this all working out. But if they are able to get him, and they get him for the 34th or 5th pick, however you want to label that. It's the 34th pick technically, because
correct. The Dolphins don't have a first round pick.
So. Yeah. But if you get him for that, okay. I think that's a high compensation, but if you truly believe that Sean Payton is the answer to what ails this team, I don't think that's paying too much. So there, I just, at the end of the day, I think Payton has not gotten quite drummed up quite the interest he had hoped, if that makes sense.
Right.
Like,
and the
I think
latest report is saying that he thought that everyone would want him, and everyone thinks they want him until they find out what he wants.
Right. And I think that's what it comes down to. I think you had a lot of teams that were interested, and then he came in and I don't want to say demanded, because we weren't in the room, but like he's saying, like, this is what my expectation levels are. And they're going, oh, okay, maybe we don't, because this is the thing. Again, the money, the power, the compensation, all of that is fine in and of itself. But when you combine all three, that's where it gets tricky, right? You're paying him
a lot of money.
Right. You're paying him either the second most or the most in the NFL, depending on if he gets 20 or 25 million.
You're taking draft capital away to do it.
Right. You're taking the draft capital away, and then you're giving him the keys to everything and saying, like, hey, bring in the coaches you want. You're probably team president, and so you're really the guy making the calls on draft day. Like, all of that, it's just, like I said, it just is all. If he came in at 10 million and wanted that, and you were going to get him for, a 5th and a 6th round pick, I think teams would be like, all right, we're in. But like the 20 million, the first round, the expectation that he's going to be the guy making all the decisions and finalizing things, I think that's tough for a lot of teams to swallow.
Yeah, and with the Cardinals especially, why would you hire a guy like Payton after hiring a guy like Ossenfort when you could have just gone with someone within the building already? And
right, you could have just promoted Adrian Wilson or Quentin Harrison, just told them, like, hey, we love you guys, we respect you guys,
or kind of given them kind of the co-situation, but really it's Payton that's making the calls.
Right.
Yeah. But basically, they're kind of they get a bump in title, like co-assistant general manager, whatever, or they maintain their say title where Payton gets the title of GM and head coach, like Buddy Ryan did. I don't know. But then they still, Harris deals with contracts, A. Wilson deals with scouting, and then ultimately Payton makes those decisions. But yeah, that would have made more sense than bringing a guy in who seems to be dead set on changing things, how things are done within the organization. So yeah. So coming up next on the Rise Up Secret podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on to another guy that came up since our last show, and that is Dan Quinn, defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys, who has been interviewed by the Cardinals and is coming in for an interview again. That's coming next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Dan Quinn, is he a legitimate candidate for the Cardinals? He was the last of the 8 names to come up, and he had a virtual interview on Saturday, and then reported on Tuesday that he was being flown in Tuesday night for his second interview. I will say this, since they're flying him in at night, you know what this has a feeling? You know how this feels like? This reminds me of the Bruce Arians, because if they're flying him at night, that means they're going to take him out to dinner, they're going to wine and dine him, then they'll probably have the formal interview in the morning. But this, on a surface, this tells me that Dan Quinn is really, really on their radar. But at the same time, because of how things line up for him in Denver, because he was a finalist there last year, because he was a coach in Seattle in 2013-2014 when Russell Wilson was there. So he's got a quarterback that he's familiar with. He's got a relationship with George Patton. He was almost hired last year. Doesn't it almost feel like, as well, another leverage? Like the Cardinals are getting leveraged again. But then I look at, they're flying him in. They flew him in Tuesday night, which means steak dinner. And that was, if we go all the way back to 2013, that was the beginning with Bruce Arians. It was because of the dinner that he had with Michael Bidwill and Steve Keim, and he dropped those F-bombs and all that fun stuff, and they clicked immediately, and that was the start of that. So Dan Quinn becomes in as the last of the 8th of the 8 names that we know are candidates. What do you think of everything with Dan Quinn so far? Because he comes with the pedigree. He's been a head coach before, so it would not be his first rodeo. What do you think of it?
I have a conspiracy theory, and that is that the Cardinals are getting their ducks in a row so that if by chance they get turned down for any of these jobs by a candidate that they offer, they're lined up with the next guy ready to go. Kent Summers tweeted out something, earlier this week. We're recording Tuesday night on the 24th, and he tweeted out the Cardinals out of the box hires don't get their first choices.
Then we go back to Andy Reid was supposedly going to come. He didn't. Mike McCarthy turned the Cardinals down for an interview. Eric Bieniemy, Mike McCoy at one point also said, "Nah, I don't want to do it." Then there was Mike Mularkey as well. So
maybe it's just guys named Mike.
Don't hire Mike. Wait, yeah, I think they got that covered this time around. But yeah, the Cardinals have never been honestly. Look at the franchise since it's been Arizona. Why would they be the first choice for any hot coaching candidate? Now, granted, they do have some good things. You've got Kyler Murray, though he's injured. You've got some really nice young pieces that you can work with both on offense and defense. And you do, say what you will. I don't know what people, but you have an owner in Michael Bidwill who's willing to make moves.
I was going to say, he spends money. He just doesn't necessarily spend the money.
Well, and isn't that more the GM's Isn't that more
right,
the GM's issue?
All right.
He's trusting his GM to say, hey, this is going to pay off. And so he's like, okay, let's do it. Let's bring in J.J. Watt. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's get Sam Bradford.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's the thing. So I think Quinn thing is literally them just lining guys up. And so it's like, and so when we came into this, the thing we had heard was that, their number one target was going to be Sean Payton. And, whether or not that was accurate or true, and it just changed with how Payton has presented himself throughout this process. I can buy that. I mean, I truly do. Because remember, at the time, it was like, okay, we're going to go after Sean Payton. And then it comes back to what we just talked about of like, okay, he wants way too much. All right, so what's next? And then it's like, let's get Frank Reich in here. Let's get Brian Flores in here. Let's get Dan Quinn in here. Let's get Vance Joseph a look. Let's give him a, and you kind of go through all of these guys. And then you say, okay, let's give them a second look. Let's give them another look around and say, okay, what are you going to bring in? Like, and so one of the things that we talked about, and I think this is where they are at probably with Dan Quinn at this point, is you look at it and you go, okay, who's your guy? Who are you bringing in that's going to be able to help us with our, $200 million quarterback? Who's the guy that's going to come in and make sure that we continue to progress with Kyler Murray over the next 1 to 2 years? Because realistically, like, that's when they can look to get out of this contract if it's not working out. And so that's got to be something they do. And like we talked about last week when oh man, who I can't remember who the national guy was that put up the point, but Jim Trotter, when Jim Trotter said, defensive candidates are coming in and laying out their like 5-year plan, basically.
But not only who their OC is, but who's their backup OC when their offensive coordinator gets hired away.
Right. And so that's where I think you're getting to with, Brian Flores, Dan Quinn, those guys. It's like, okay, spell it out for me, lay it out for me, walk me through your process and what your 5 years is going to look like with these guys. And I honestly, I respect that. Like, and then that way they can make a decision based on those things. And, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But let me ask you this. I've talked to some people and gotten some information just with this Dan Quinn stuff coming out about who could potentially be their OC. And the name that's been brought up is Brian Schottenheimer. So Schottenheimer, his background is
he's been all over. He's been all over.
He was an offensive coordinator from 2006 to 2011. Just so we're like all on the same page, when in 2006 he was 33.
Yeah.
So like he was
granted, he's Marty Schottenheimer's kid.
Right there. But before that, I mean, I could list everything. But before that, yeah, he did work through the ranks.
He's worked with wide receivers, tight ends, quarterbacks. So he worked with the then Redskins as a quarterbacks coach and the Chargers. So he worked with the Chargers 2002 to 2005. He was an offensive coordinator with the Jets. Then he was the offensive coordinator for the Rams under Jeff Fisher. He was quarterbacks coach for Andrew Luck. He was the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks 2018 to 2020 when we saw Russell Wilson really start to put up big numbers. But at the same time, he was also the coordinator that Russell Wilson got fired.
Yeah, and so you look at it,
But he's this past year he's been with the Cowboys as a coaching analyst, which does line up as the type of guy who would leave with Quinn to some job with the team.
Right. And so again, what does that do for you? Is that interesting? I don't know. That's just, a name that's been brought up. So do with the information what you will. But, it gives you an idea of who could be there. Because again, with Brian Flores, we had hoped or heard that it was potentially going to be Bill O'Brien. Well, that ship has sailed.
Correct. He's going to New England.
Yeah. So Matt Patricia.
So that'd be, if you look at his time when Dan Quinn was head coach, his greatest success came when he had Kyle Shanahan as his offensive coordinator. Those were the 2 years that they were really good. That's when they went to the Super Bowl. And then the success that they had offensively after that was not the same. It just wasn't the same after Kyle Shanahan left.
And so let me ask you this. I know we're going to get to the other candidate potentially, but what are your thoughts on this idea that they're lining up multiple candidates? Because it's now come out that Monti Ossenfort, who you and I, for the record, both are, we both are excited about that hire. I don't think we have any real negatives about that hire. That being said, allegedly per Jay Glazer, he was not their first choice.
Right. And we will get to that a little bit. But yeah, it just shows again the Cardinals don't get their first choice. So you look at who is their first choice, or maybe Payton was their first choice and they're a little bit leery about it. But look at the candidates they got up.
And I would be fine with that. Like if they're moving on from him because of the ridiculous demands, I 100% think that's reasonable.
But then you've got a bunch of guys, you've got a bunch of, these are a lot of retreads and newcomers. So you got Frank Reich, just fired. You've got Vance Joseph, was fired as a head coach. Brian Flores was fired as a head coach. You got Dan Quinn, was fired as a head coach. At the same time, and then you've got your guys that haven't been there yet. You got Aaron Glenn from the Lions. You've got Ejiro Evero from the Broncos. The guys that haven't done it yet. And so you wonder, well, what's the best way to go about? So you've got there's a long line of coaches who have failed their first time through that have had great success the second time because they kind of learn what worked and what didn't work. They kind of change. And so you've got yourself some nice. You've got some. And then you've got DeMeco Ryans, who is the hot guy, the guy that seems to have all the momentum, but just had too many interviews last weekend and everything like that. So you've got Reich, you've got Vance Joseph, you've got Dan Quinn, all of those guys who have been there before, and Brian Flores, and is there one that's better than the other? That's when you don't know.
Let me ask you about this. So you and I were big on Reich.
2018. I wanted him to. Yeah. I don't know why he wasn't considered in 2018.
And so he goes to Indy as the head coach. His 5 seasons in Indy, he had 5 full seasons in Indy. He had 1 losing season. 10-6 made the playoffs, won a playoff game. 7-9, 11-5 lost a playoff game.
Had to deal with Andrew Luck's retirement, so he had a Jacoby Brissett year.
And then went 9-8 last year, didn't make the playoffs. And even in being fired this year, he was 3-5-1. So I mean, it's not like he was like
that was a terrible Matt Ryan this year.
So let me ask you this: my concerns are that personality-wise, I think we talked about this. He's a little bit like Cliff, little laid back. My other concern is he's going to be 62. And, well, guys can coach into their 70s. Is it... what's the word I'm looking for? I mean...
Well, let's be honest. No Cardinals coach has ever made it past 6 seasons. So to think he's going to be a long-term answer, that's kind of a stretch.
But ideally, and I know you're exactly right, but ideally with Monty now, who's I believe is 43, 42, 43.
Younger than me, stupid. Everything's stupid.
But don't you kind of want guys that can be together in the idyllic, successful world?
Yes, but that wasn't that almost the exact same thing 10 years ago with Kaiman Arians? And you kind of worried about it, but my goodness, it worked.
Yeah, and that's the thing, exactly. You look at it, this is something where ideally, you just get the right guy, whether he's, 50 or 60 or 40 or 30, doesn't matter as long as it's the right guy. But I do wonder if that comes into play with a Reich, because like you said, though, 6 years, that would be, he's 68, and that would be the longest tenured head coach in Arizona Cardinal or in franchise history. Sorry.
That's absurd. It's absurd. But yeah, and the one thing, like the Reich, it would be an interesting hire because there's no connection other than Ossenfort would have known Reich as an opponent. And Brian Flores there's a very clear connection, and without knowing, I had to look, when I first look at it, not only were they both there with the Patriots forever, is that Brian Flores first started in the scouting department. So Monty and Brian Flores worked side by side, literally.
Yeah.
Before Flores went to the coaching side of things.
And
then you got DeMeco Ryans, we'll talk a little bit about that, is that Ossenfort scouted him for the Texans the year before the Texans drafted him, and the new assistant general manager was there in the scouting department when Ryans was drafted, and so there's a clear connection there as well. So, and all the other ones, you're like, they make good candidates, but you still think that Brian Flores might make the most sense organizationally, whether it's the flashiest name, it just, for what they're trying to do as an organization, it does. He seems like the one that makes the perfect sense.
Yeah, and I really do think he makes the most sense still. I really do. And you, like you said, they're kind of, everything kind of aligns together. You look at Flores' background and history. Again, he's kind of similar to Reich, in 5-11 his first year, but 10-6 and 9-8. Never made the playoffs, but again, those last two seasons, 19-14. That's fantastic, and we know in that 21 season that they were asking him to not put forth his best effort. And so when you look at it from all of that and the fact that he still won, I think the biggest issue with Flores is, like I said, you've got to figure out who's going to be his OC. 4 offense coordinators in 3 seasons in Miami.
He did not work well with Tua.
No, he did not work well with Tua. You don't want Chan Gailey back. Let's just be honest. George Godsey and Eric Stoodsville, neither of those guys are inspiring confidence. And so you're just going to have to figure out, what it is and what the plan is and where it's going to work out. And I just really don't know from that perspective what he brings, but I can tell you that he's, been a good, I think he's done a good job as a coach.
And then it comes out, because this was with the Steelers this last year, that he was kind of instrumental for rookie Kenny Pickett, and at least for how he handled himself in no huddle 2-minute type drills. And so Flores was kind of instrumental for some of his development there, even though he was a linebackers coach and defensive assistant. Flores had influence on Pickett's development last year, which, that's not a bad thing to hear.
No, and quite frankly, when you look at the names that are out there. We've talked about, I think, LaFleur, is it Mike LaFleur, makes sense, and I think Zach Robinson also makes sense. Like, again, young guys that probably will get snapped up if they come in and have some success in 23 and 24 with the Cardinals and Kyler, and so, getting hot commodities is never a bad thing, or having hot commodities is never a bad thing. But that's going to be the key to this whole situation, is making sure that they're prepared for whatever comes next.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, special of Cardinals Talk on the Web, we'll move on to talk about one of the other candidates that didn't actually interview, but was supposed to. That's DeMeco Ryans, defensive coordinator of the San Francisco 49ers. That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals Talk on the Web. And, DeMeco Ryans is perhaps the hot shot candidate this year because of the work that he has done with the defense of the San Francisco 49ers the last 2 seasons. Their defense has been every bit as good as it was even after that they lost Robert Saleh to the New York Jets as their head coach. DeMeco Ryans also has had a long reputation as kind of as an up-and-comer, as a player, well-respected, kind of did everything right. J.J. Watt came out and said, when he was drafted, one of the first things he got a place that was basically on the same street because of DeMeco Ryans, because, hey, if he thought it was a good idea, it must be a good idea. That's how respected he was in the locker room. He's made his way up through the coaching ranks rather quickly, and those San Francisco players rave about him as a leader, which makes you super, super excited for what he could be as a head coach. However, he had 4 interviews lined up last Saturday, the day before the Cowboys and 49ers were to play in the divisional round of the playoffs. He got through the first 2 interviews of the day and canceled or postponed, but the report was canceled, the 2 other interviews, as he wanted to spend time with his team and getting ready for that game against the Cowboys, one that they ultimately won, and they move on to the NFC Championship game. When the report came out that he canceled one of the Cardinals and the Colts, what was your reaction? Was it one of, how the heck did he end up with 4 interviews in the same day, the day before a game? And 2, did it feel like he was spurning the Cardinals, or was it just logistical?
I think it was just logistical. But, you can't. It's always going to look worse than it is, so you just deal with the situation as it goes and kind of go from there.
Yeah, and the question comes down to this is, was it canceled or postponed? Did he say, hey, let's reschedule this, and it turns out that now the Cardinals and no one can talk to Ryans until after the NFC title game, so not till next week when they have the bye before the Super Bowl. No talking the coaches on any of those staffs this week, and so it's not going to be on a new week. So we won't find out for a minute, and maybe that'll be too long for the Cardinals. Maybe they'll have their coach decided by the end of the week, and if not, and if so, was it a case where DeMeco, if they really wanted DeMeco Ryans, and if they really wanted him, you'd think that they wait for him, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so maybe it was being spurned.
Yeah, maybe it is. My thought process is, until they hire somebody or they don't have something signed up or lined up with him, then I'm just going to assume that they're going to reschedule it. And then if they hire somebody outside of that, then, it wasn't going to work out. I don't think there's an issue one way or the other, but I
do like the connection that there now is, because I didn't put 2 and 2 together, and I will admittedly, I will give credit to Alex Sutton, who is one of the contributing writers on Cards Wire, who texted me and said, it's DeMeco now. He's a little bit of a degenerate and wants to bet everything, and so he's saying money's on DeMeco. He said money's on DeMeco because of the connection with Dave Sears and Monti Ossenfort. And then I had to go back and do a little research. So DeMeco Ryans was drafted by the Texans in 2006. Monti Ossenfort worked for the Texans 2004-2005 in the scouting department, and his assistant, his new assistant that we're going to talk about, Dave Sears, was on the scouting staff in 2006 when DeMeco Ryans was drafted. And so there is a connection. There is a connection that makes sense because they would both Sears and Ossenfort would definitely know what DeMeco, even he was a very young DeMeco Ryans, is all about. So, but they would know about that. That said, it'll be interesting to see what happens as a guy like Ryans, because of the success of their team, sometimes gets overlooked in a coaching cycle because of the team success. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out because, you'd get him in the same division as Kyle Shanahan, so you create a little natural rivalry there. A guy who is J.J. Watt came out when the Houston Texans announced that they completed their interview with Ryans, and J.J. Watt raved about him as a man, as a human being, as a leader. It's the type of candidate that you would get excited about more so. So this is is he more than say a Vance Joseph was or a Steve Wilkes was coming out because they'd never been a head coach, had some defense coordinators, but the difference is his defenses have been elite the past 2 seasons.
They have, but that's the thing too, is like you look at and I'm not downgrading what he's done, and so I don't want anybody to think I am. But he has the best linebacker in the NFL in Fred Warner. And
right next to him, one of the better ones in Drake Greenlaw.
Right.
And the best pass rusher in Nick Bosa.
And that's what I was going to say, and the best pass rusher. So it's really hard to be like, oh, it's going to come to Arizona and, they're going to have, well, maybe you get Will Anderson and he's a top 5 game-changing pass rusher, but
you have some, like, you've got your Isaiah Simmons and Zaven Collins. You have to be excited about those. You've got your Buda Baker, Jalen Thompson.
Well, and that's what you have to hope, is that he is able to.
He can unlock the talent. Maybe
right.
You can't expect any of them to be Fred Warner, but could they be great?
Could they be Dre Greenlaw and the other guy who's Al Shazier, I believe it is? Mm-hmm. Can they be those guys? And if they can, okay, then that's obviously better than what they are, and so that's pushing them in the proper direction. But it's unfair to expect them to be that. Does that make sense?
Don't expect we're just going to draft a guy who's going to be Bobby Wagner or Ray Lewis or Mike Smith.
Right.
So don't do that. Don't do that to them.
Right. And so that's the big thing when you look at it is, you've got, and that's the thing is like Talana Hufanga, who,
surprise.
Well, not if you listen to the original Draft Breakdown podcast,
Ooh.
but that's the thing is you've got 3 All-Pros on that team, or on that defense, just on the defense. Fred Warner, Hufanga, and Bosa.
And you got the best left tackle in the league. You got the best, I'm going to say, you got the best overall tight end in the league in George Kittle.
And you have, 3 weapons in Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and
a healthy Christian McCaffrey is probably still the best running back in the NFL because of his complete skill set.
And so all of that, makes them, and I think, again, we can't overstate how important like a Nick Bosa is. And the reason I say that is when you look at the Arizona Cardinals defense this year, right? You look at it, they don't have a Nick Bosa. There's no questioning that. They only had 8 less sacks as a team than the 49ers. The 49ers as a team had 44 total sacks. Nick Bosa had 18 and a half. So that's 6 sacks more than J.J. Watt had, who had 12 and a half. But the rest of their contributions were similar. And so that's the thing is when you have a guy, like Nick Bosa, who had, I think it was like something absurd, like 48 quarterback hits, to go with 18 and a half sacks, because that's the thing. JJ Watt had 12.5 sacks, but he also only had 25 quarterback hits, which is really good. But you're talking about Nick Bosa double that. And so like those are the things you need to understand, that like you're not bringing that with you. But you do have the chance to draft Will Anderson. So, maybe
that's absurd.
Right. That's more than Watt and Marcus Allen or Marcus Golden combined.
Basically, Nick Bosa was in the face of a quarterback. Gosh.
Yeah.
Because that's a lot.
Yeah. And so that's the thing, is like you look at it, you're just not bringing that over here. And so if people need to understand, like, just because you're hiring the guy that puts elite players position to make elite plays doesn't mean that they're going to have the same success. Now, I will say, if they're able to draft Will Anderson, that there is a chance that you could see similar numbers. But like, again, you're not like Hufanga and base sense, but you don't have Fred Warner, and Isaiah Simmons is going to be, like you said, and David Collins will be better, but they're still not going to play at the Fred Warner level. That's just an unfair expectation. So, I would like to at least get to interview DeMeco, but if it doesn't happen, there's no reason to, sit on this for another 2 weeks if you can't.
Absolutely. Coming up next on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web, let's talk about a move that was mildly surprising. And they hired an assistant general manager. That's coming next on Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise of Sea Red podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. They've hired Monti Ossenfort in a move which was mildly surprising. Came out over the weekend that the Cardinals hiring away the director of college scouting from the Detroit Lions, Dave Sears, to be the assistant general manager to Ossenfort, which is interesting because, to my memory, dating back as far back as I can remember at all with the Cardinals, I do not believe that they have ever had an assistant general manager. Even when Buddy Ryan was general manager, I believe Bob Ferguson held the title that Quentin Harris had, and was VP of Player Personnel. VP of Player Personnel, as just how that tends to go in NFL teams, is the title just below assistant general manager. Jason Licht was not an assistant general manager. Quentin Harris is not an assistant general manager. Rod Graves does not have an assistant general manager. I do not recall a time in Cardinals history, at least in Arizona, where they had an assistant general manager. And so so my initial reaction was, well, that's weird, but good. So Ossenfort was able to get his guy, a guy he worked with side by side in Houston way back in the day, to poach him from, who's the director of college scouting over in Detroit, who's had some pretty good drafts recently, to be his right-hand man. But it overlooks both Adrian Wilson and Quentin Harris, who have those other titles, and it says that maybe they are not, they're letting Monty do his thing, which seems to signal perhaps a soon coming goodbye for one or both of those other guys.
Yeah, it feels like it. And, you mentioned what they've done. So in the last couple of years, you look at it, you've got TJ Hawkinson, who they traded away for, good draft picks. But they also were able to draft Amani I can't pronounce his name, but who's a starting corner in this league, and a good one. So that's not a bad thing, right? Warrior, thank you. They, were able to draft Jeff Okudah, who has been injured. DeAndre Swift looks like the real deal.
Julian Williams, woo!
Yeah, Julian Aquara has had a good, introduction into the league, and looks like he's going to be a guy that can help out as a two-way linebacker. So you've got a lot of, success. And then you mentioned it, Penei Sewell, and Alan McNeil both kind of stood out this year. In year 2, Amon St. Brown is a dynamic weapon at receiver, averaging over 1,000 yards a season in his first 2 years, which is, that's a 5th round pick or 4th round pick. That's putting up 1,000-yard seasons. And remember, they had, I think you were the starting quarterback last year for the Lions. I don't remember off the top of my head, but
they resurrected Jared Goff.
Right. And so you have that. And then, like this year, I mean, it's really easy when you have to take Aiden Hutchinson. Oh, wow. But think about the fact in the 6th round, they picked a guy in James Houston out of Jackson State who had more sacks than anybody not named J.J. Watt on the Arizona Cardinals. And by the way, he played in 7 games. And he finished with 8 sacks on the season.
Wow.
8 sacks, 11 quarterback hits. He missed most of the first part of the season with an injury. So that's the thing. It's
that's nice. And then you look at this. That's the type of scouting process, because Ossenfort said he wanted to change how things were done in the organization. Not necessarily that the way that Cardinals have been doing it wrong. It's just the way that Ossenfort wants to do it is different. And he's bringing in a guy who's done it, I'm assuming it's the same way for Detroit, and have had very good results.
They have, and again, we talked about the Ossenfort stuff, but you look at their drafts, since he took over, and you've got corners, heavy defensive linemen, heavy offensive linemen, and then they sprinkle in those wide receivers or tight ends or running backs. Like, they always draft one, but they're in different spots. It's not like they're just it's not like they're going to the well every time. And so you look at it, like TJ Hawkinson was drafted top 8. He's a 2-time Pro Bowler. Can you remind me the last guy not named Kyler Murray that made a Pro Bowl the Cardinals drafted? So you have that. And then you've got Jonah Jackson, who's a 3rd round guard that they picked, a Pro Bowler. Again, like, when was the last time the Cardinals picked a 3rd rounder that made the Pro Bowl? Those are situations where you look at it, and the guy that's the director of college scouting is saying, here you go. And it's one more thing that you and I talked about last week, and I think this is a big deal. Remember, we mentioned that Monti Ossenfort was going to be behind because he was the director of pro personnel for the Titans, wasn't he?
Yes.
And so he was going to be a little bit behind in the draft process because he couldn't take the reports that the Titans had already and all of this stuff. Well, guess what? Now he just hired the director of college scouting from the Detroit Lions to be his right-hand man. So all of a sudden, you're not leaning on Arizona Cardinals scouts. You're still going to lean on them, but you've got the guy that's nailed picks like Hawkinson and Aquaro and Jackson and Penei Sewell and Alan McNeil, like Amon St. Brown, like you've nailed those picks, and you're getting that guy that helped make those picks, and he's going to be here for this draft season. So it's not going to be the Steve Keim guys that are feeding information to Monty. They will still be, but you have now a check in Dave Sears, who's spent his entire year as the director of college scouting looking at the 2023 NFL draft.
Coming next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk. And let's talk briefly about a report that came out over the weekend. Oh, no, it came out on... So we recorded last Tuesday night. It came out Wednesday, and then we posted the show. So something about the Ossenfort hiring that's a little bit sad. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Last week on Monday, the Cardinals announced the hiring of Monti Ossenfort. We talked about it in detail. He was introduced to the media on Tuesday. We talked about it on our show Tuesday night, published a show on Wednesday. But before the show published, on Wednesday morning, there was a report that said that one of the guys the Cardinals interviewed, Chicago Bears assistant general manager Ian Cunningham, actually turned down the job. Not just this job, but also another job with the Titans. But so Ossenfort wasn't the Cardinals' first choice. And that is a terrible report to come out literally a day after that Ossenfort is introduced to the media. And it's just yet another stupid thing that we have to deal with the Cardinals. And so while everyone's all excited about Ossenfort, then the next day come out, it's like, oh, the guy they wanted didn't want the job.
Yeah, and you look at, what Ian Cunningham has done in the NFL, in his background. I think he's a guy that people like, and they like his background. He worked for the Ravens as a player personnel assistant from 2008 to 2012, and an area scout from 2013 to 2016. So you look at, those times that the Ravens were a powerhouse, won a Super Bowl, right? So obviously, whenever you get the Ravens name mentioned, people tend to, no pun intended, flock to that, right? Because you've got a good history. Then you've got him with the Eagles from 17 and 18. And I believe he was there when they won the Super Bowl, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that would be, yes.
And so he's with two organizations that put together Super Bowl roster, Super Bowl teams. He's been and he was the director of college scouting in that time. And then assistant director of player personnel for the Bears in 19 and 20, and then the director of player personnel in 21. So you kind of look at the career of Ian Cunningham, and you see a guy who's, worked his way up through the ranks and kind of put in his time, and he wants an opportunity. It is interesting. So, when he was with the Bears, they went 8-8, and then 6-11, and then he was promoted to director of player personnel in 21. They went 6-11 that year, and again, I'm not, it is what it is. But and then obviously this year 3-14, the worst team in the NFL, the first pick in the NFL draft. So it is interesting that there's a couple of things about this. One, the Chicago Bears equally have a negative reputation from a management standpoint as the Arizona Cardinals. Remember, their owner, Miss Virginia McCaskey, is literally 100 years old. And, since she took over, they won a Super Bowl, and then, they've been the Bears, which is, still probably better than the Cardinals, but, not by a whole lot. The second thing is, I get having the first pick in the draft, but as the director of player personnel, you're less involved in the draft process and more involved in the free agency process. Now, I'm going to be honest, I did not look at their salary cap space in this offseason, but it is a bit peculiar. Oh, and they have the most cap space, $92 million. So maybe he just wanted to have some toys to play with one last time. I don't know. I honestly, I don't let that bother me, because a lot of times there's stuff that we don't know, and some of it can be straight up the fact that there's something potentially in place for him down the road. And maybe they have an idea of something that they're going to do with him or utilize him in a way that makes him want to stick around. And he was, getting these interviews, I don't want to say out of the way, but out of the way, so he's prepared when maybe a different / more prestigious position comes open, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing is Cunningham. Well, interestingly enough, because he was among the general manager candidates, it's the one that kind of was the hot name around the league. He'd been part of the accelerator program. In fact, that's where Michael Bidwell had talked at length with him at. But it just was a bit of a downer. You're like, of course, after they introduce their new general manager, we find out that he wasn't their first choice. But we should be used to that because the Cardinals often don't get their first choice, and it's probably one of the reasons why they've always promoted from within.
Yeah, and that's, you wonder if, again, not trying to say anything, but like the devil type of situation.
Yeah.
Like I know what I'm getting into with Virginia McCaskey. Like I know what I have there. And he doesn't with obviously with Michael. And so he's just like, I don't know if that's where I want to go the first time. And let's be honest, with the Titans situation, firing the GM and keeping Mike Vrabel, it makes it a less
it's an interesting scenario. It's just weird.
Right. It makes it a less intriguing place to be if it's not your guy. Remember, that's a big thing for a lot of people, is like,
right,
I want to be able to hitch my wagon to my guy.
Right. And with that, let's go ahead and wrap up this edition of the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web, episode 391. We still have lots to talk about, but until there's a head coach in place, we have the general manager in place, it's really going to be really hard to talk about the roster. So we will likely be back next week to talk about the playoffs and maybe a hiring, maybe more interviews. But that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening as always. Go Cardinals.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise up, See Red.